Shalom, my dear friends. Shalom from the holy city of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. Today, the 14th day of the month of Sivan of the year 5777, corresponding to the 8th of June of the year 2017. And we continue today with our studies in the Tanakh, in Sefer Iyov, the book of Job, and in the holy Mishnah, tractate Shabbat. And I hope that everybody is now all receiving video and audio, and we're able to proceed with today's studies. Shalom, today the 14th day of the month of Sivan of the year 5777, corresponding to the 8th of June of the year 2017. And today we continue with our studies in the book of Job, Sefer Iyov, standing now on the very threshold of the true climax of this extraordinary work of biblical literature, now about to enter into what, in my personal view, is perhaps one of the most sublime of all passages in biblical literature, a passage of profound depth, when after all of the debates between Iyov and his companions, with Iyov having begged and requested that God would answer him, in our chapter begins indeed the answer of God to Iyov. Vaya'an Hashem et Iyov min ha'se'ara vayomar. God answered Job from the se'ara, from the storm wind, and he spoke. What an extraordinary and awesome moment after all of the suffering of Job and after all of the reproofs of his companions, after the careful preparation by Elihu in the last chapters of Job to attain these heights that he now reaches when God himself speaks to Iyov as a prophet of the nations. God speaks to Job out of the se'ara, the storm wind. Well, these chapters certainly deserve some introduction to understand what lies ahead of us. God will challenge Job with a succession of questions that leave Job baffled by the details of God's providence over the entire universe, baffled and stunned into silence and humility. Indeed, this is perhaps the purpose of the whole book, to cut down our arrogance and bring us to humility, for it is out of the attribute of humility that comes wisdom. And Job had expressed that his goal is to attain wisdom, and now after the preparations of Elihu, the Almighty himself reveals to Job the secrets of wisdom. So in the first of these chapters 38 and 39, there is a succession of these questions, a total of 50 questions enumerated by our sages that God puts to Job one after the other in the most beautiful of language, challenging Job with these depictions of different aspects of the creation of the luminaries, the heavens, the earth hanging upon nothing, the elements, and then coming to the wildlife and the mysteries of the wildlife. And then later on in this series of addresses to Job by the Almighty, he begins to challenge him about if he understands or could control the horse, loving the battle. And he comes to two mysterious creatures that are the subject of many, many allegorical teachings and Kabbalistic ideas, the Behemoth and the Leviathan, these two creatures being the very summit of God's creation, and God rules over all. And then by the end of chapter 41, Job is totally humbled and when he addresses God, he expresses his humility. And then the book comes to its conclusion with the repair, where Job prays for his companions who God himself said fell short, and Job is restored to his prosperity. And we see thus a book that is so masterfully structured in its composition and the development of the plot from the beginning, with Job in his time of prosperity and success, and the test by the called by God to the Satan, and the destruction of Job's prosperity, then his physical health, and coming down into the ashes, the sackcloth in mourning, and the successive addresses to him by his companions and his rejection of them, and finally the intervention of Elihu. Everything is leading up to now these chapters. So let us start. Before we do enter the Hebrew text, we can look momentarily at the first verse to get our bearings. The first verse itself is one of the mysteries of the Masoret, of the way that the Tanakh Hebrew scrolls are written. Vaya'an Adonai es Iyov min ha-se'oro vayomar. Here once again we go back to the Tetragrammaton, the divine name, that has scarcely had a mention since the very beginning of the book, setting the plot in heaven with the divine court and God challenging the Satan. And here once again now God, the source of all creation, the source of all prophecy, Hashem, in his name of Havaya, which is the essential name of the Torah. It is now Hashem that answers Iyov. Here we see the word that is articulated, min ha-se'oro, min, out of the se'oro, the raging storm wind, is all in the Hebrew written as one word. And we shall have occasion to comment on this in some of the teachings of our sages. Then that God begins to address Job. Who is this that is darkening counsel with words without da'at, without true knowledge and understanding? Who is this, Job? What are you saying here? Listen, I'm going to challenge you with these questions. Well, to start with some of the introductory comments of our sages in their commentaries on this chapter, beginning at chapter 38. Rashi, with whom we start, comments on the expression min ha-se'oro. The Hebrew word se'oro, spelled in our text with a sin letter, is also the word that sounds pretty much like it. In our text, the word is spelled with a samach. I'm sorry, I made a mistake with the samach. But elsewhere in the Hebrew text, the word se'ara with a sin refers to a human hair. And Rashi tells us the allegorical interpretation of these opening words, Vayan Hashem et Iyov min ha-se'ara, he answered him as it were from the hair, says Rashi, here on this text, will count the number of your hairs, and then I will answer you as many reasons against each and every one of them as you want. I have no end of answers for you. Now, another indication here in our text which Rashi brings forth is that Rashi here continues in his comment on verse 1, min ha-se'ara, from the Sa'ara, out of this very storm wind, which Job previously in chapter 9, verse 17, had said, Basa'ara yishufeni, he is grinding me down with his storm wind. As we shall hear at the end of the chapter in verse 25, who divided the channel in the floodgates? Rashi continues, he says, every single hair has its own cavity out of which it grows. And we shall be hearing more of this in just a moment. Rashi continues in the same comment, he says, with the Se'ara, this storm wind of raging chastisements, he originally smote him, and now with the Se'ara, with this address to Job out of the Se'ara, the hair, he heals him. Well, now, that is the first comment of Rashi, highly midrashic. The Mitzunat David tells us, Mina Se'ara, out of the storm wind, this is the Ruach, the Holy Spirit that is revealed out of the storm wind, and we shall have presently from Ramban elaboration on this point. But before we do turn to Ramban, who will explain to us about the prophetic levels that Job now attains and what it means, before that, let us first of all look at the Talmudic comments. First of all, in the Sugya of Job found in the Babylonian Talmud of Bava Basra, page 16, Tesazayin Amud Aleph, the Talmud says there, the Amorah Rabbah said, Job had vilified heaven, cheref, he attacked and fumed against heaven, bisa'ara, with the storm wind, when he'd said, as quoted by Rashi, that God was grinding him down with this storm wind. And now the Talmud says, with the storm wind did he answer him? With the storm wind, he vilified, Job had vilified heaven when he said, he's grinding me down with the storm wind. He said before God, Master of the universe, maybe the storm wind passed before you on its way out and it made a mistake between Eov and Oyev. There was a hairline error of the Se'ara, this Ruach Se'ara, that made a mistake and found Eov and thought that Eov is the Oyev, the enemy, because God has been treating him like an enemy. And God then answered him with the Se'ara, with the storm wind out of the hair, as it were, out of the hair of the storm. As the Gemara here, the Talmud quotes our verse, Vayan Hashem es Eov min ha'se'orah. God answered Job out of the storm wind, and he said, gird yourself like a man, your loins, and I shall ask you, and you make it known to me. God is saying, darshans the Talmud, there are many hairs that I've created in man, and every single hair that I created it in its own cavity, the own follicle out of which it's growing by itself individually. So there's never any two hairs that are both suckling their nurture out of the one follicle. Because if there were ever two that were sucking out of one and the same root, that would totally darken the eyes of a person. It would upset the whole system, even a tiny error like that between two cells. If it is so that in my creation there's never an error where one follicle, one growth point is changed for another, then how could it be that I made any error between Eov and Oyev, that I thought that Eov was my enemy? That is to say, certainly not. None of this was as treating you as an enemy. God is saying, I made no such mistake. That is the beautiful homily that comes out of this verse, min ha-se'ara, just as God makes no error between one hair and another. So detailed is his hashgacha, providence. So he certainly made no error in the case of Job. Well, now, another section, also in the words of our sages, before we do come to a Ramban, is a section from Bereshit Rabbah, the Midrash of Bereshit Rabbah, which also alludes to our verse. It tells us that there was a certain Kuti, that is to say, a Samaritan, who asked Rabbi Meir, could it be that the one of whom it is written, do I not fill the heavens and the earth, that he would speak with Moses between the two poles of the Ark of the Covenant? Rabbi Meir said to this man, bring me a big mirror. He brought him the mirror, and he said to him, look at your image in the mirror. He saw that because it was a big mirror, that was probably an expanding mirror, he saw himself big. He said to him, now bring me a small mirror, a mirror that diminishes the image. He brought him and he said to him, look at yourself in this mirror. He said, well, the image is small. He says to him, well, just like you that are flesh and blood, you can change yourself just as much as you want, project yourself in this way, project yourself in that way. He who spoke and the universe came into being, how much more so? When he wants, indeed, he does fill the heavens and the earth, but when he wants, he can speak in this concentrated manner between the two poles of the ark with Moses. And the Midrash continues, said Ravino Barsis, there are times when even the entire universe is simply unable to contain his whole glory, the glory of our God, but there are other times when he can speak to a person between the hairs of his own head, the hairs of the person's head, as it's written, Vaya'an Hashem es Iyov min ha'se'oro, Hashem answered Job between out of the se'ara, the storm wind, mibein se'arot rosho, out of between the hairs of his head. So I think we see from this last midrash, particularly the concept of tzimtzum, of the concentration and contraction of the divine light from its infinite source into even the tiniest detail of creation, which is both a teaching about God's providence and a teaching about how God can communicate with us out of anything and even from the hairs of our head. So with that, let us look at the words of introduction to this section of Ramban Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. Vayan Hashem et Yov min ha'se'ara v'yomar. Writes Ramban, now Job reaches the level of prophecy, because he was indeed tam v'yashar Yareh Elokim v'sur me'ra. He was indeed tam, pure, yashar, upright, Yareh Elokim, in fear of God, v'sur me'ro, he turned aside from evil. V'huchach al nisayon, he was tested by this great test. And even though he sinned, when he expressed his doubts about the justice of God's dealings with him through a lack of wisdom, the test availed to him to draw him close to God, because he accepted the words of Elihu, and he saw that they were adequate to answer his question. So now he is indeed Yorei Elokim, fearing of God, but Tzaddik Tomim, a truly whole, unblemished, righteous tzaddik. Continues Ramban, when it says that God in our text spoke to him out of the se'ara, and the literal meaning is indeed the storm wind, Ramban says it is not that the heavens were opened up for him and that he saw the Mar'os Elokim, the visions of God, clearly in the way that is said of Isaiah and Ezekiel, that he saw the Lord sitting upon his throne, or that an angel spoke through him. It's just that, in the words of Ramban, he heard the great Se'ara, the great storm wind, and he attained what the first prophets attained at the beginning of their vision. As it says of Ezekiel, at the beginning, I saw, and there was a Ruach Se'ara, the storm wind coming out of the north, Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4. Likewise with Elijah, Eliyahu. At the beginning, it says that God was passing, and there was a mighty Ruach, Gedolah v'chazak mefarek harim shaber seraim. That's 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. There was this great wind, mighty, breaking the mountains and smashing the rocks. And continues Ramban, after the spirit and the quaking and the shaking, the rash, after the rash, the quaking, there came the esh, the fire, and afterwards the prophets would attain their prophecy. And indeed, there is a clear proof over this in the case of Ezekiel, after he saw the spirit, the wind and the great cloud, which is the and then the rash, the quaking, and the esh mitlakachat, the fire flaming all over. Job attained at the beginning of his vision that the voice came to him, answering him with tremendous power and strength, with a tremendous raging storm, as customary with the prophets, like it says there in Ezekiel, in verse 24 of Ezekiel 1, like the voice, the sound of manifold waters, like the voice of Shaddai, the Eternal, when the waters are passing, and the turbulent commotion of the sound of the camp. And says Ramban, Job attained this through what he heard out of the storm wind and the voice that came out of it, and he knew from all that was said that this is the voice of God that was answering him over and giving him an answer to his words. And the purpose of this address by God to Job is to inform Job that God indeed is tamim de'im, completely perfect in knowledge, omniscience, in all of the overall generalities of creation, all in every detail, in each and every creature, each and every person, and that God has providence over all of them. And that man is actually, he says in the Hebrew, niv'ar mida'as, haklol. Man is like a beast when it comes to his deprived and stripped of knowledge of all of this. And what is the foundation and the nature of the world? And how much more so could man not know the judgment of God and its secrets? And God alludes to Job that the secret given over by Elihu is the truth. For so far Job had not received it entirely from Elihu. It says Ramban, Job so far had taken the words of Elihu conditionally, that it could be that that's what he says. And that would be the answer, the various answers Elihu gave over the question of why the righteous may suffer. He says that would be could be the answer to why the righteous may suffer while the wicked prospers. But Elihu had no proof over what Elihu had said, and a person cannot know this except, says Ramban, b'derech Kabbalah, that is to say, through the mode of receiving, that is to say, he receives it from a higher source. So now God indeed says to him and confirms that this is the way that the justice works as Elihu had expressed it. And that is God's mode of dealing with us. And says Ramban, I've already explained that Elihu made known the reason why the tzaddik may suffer, which was Job's main complaint. And Job saw this as being unfair, a kind of violence against humanity. But Elihu had not explained to him why it might be that the righteous, that the wicked prosper. But Job now can learn from the understanding he has of the righteous that has suffering. He can infer what is the reason why the wicked may prosper. And in the course of God's answer to Job, he will indeed reveal why it may be that the wicked prosper and why it may be that the tzaddik suffers. And this gives completion to Job's understanding of this subject. God does not speak about the tzaddik that suffers because Elihu has already addressed this. But so that is Ramban's opening commentary on this chapter of God's answer to Job. With that said, let us take a look at one of the priceless treasures that we have, and this is an edition of the Sefer Yetzirah, the earliest of all the Kabbalistic texts that is attributed to Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, a collection of 6 chapters of the secrets of the creation through the power of the 22 Hebrew letters, the 3 mother letters, the 7 so-called doubled letters, Bet Gimel Dalet Chof Pei Resh Taf, and the 12 remaining simple letters. And the whole Sefer Yetzirah in its 6 chapters is built up on explaining the secrets of the creation of time and space and the inhabitants of the time-space universe. And besides the Sefer Yetzirah itself, we have priceless commentaries on the different versions of this ancient Mishnah that have come down to us. The Sefer Yetzirah is mentioned in the Talmud as having been known to the later Amoraim, who even applied its secrets. We've already found in Rashi's commentary on Job that Rashi, living in the 11th century, was familiar with the existence of the Sefer Yetzirah and certainly had some grasp of what was in it, but is taciturn about any more than that. And Rashi generally does not speak about the Kabbalah. But it was among the other priceless commentaries we have on Sefer Yetzirah are a commentary by Ramban himself that we have been following through Job. Ramban, living at in the 13th century, but an older sage than Ramban, who indeed Ramban received teachings from through the Kabbalistic tradition, was one known to us as Rabbi Avraham ben David of the French city of Bosquer. Rabbi Avraham ben David was an older contemporary of Maimonides, Rambam. Rambam was born in about 1130. The Rabbi Avram ben David, known to us as Ravad, Rabbi Avram ben David Ravad, was born in 1120 and passed away in 1198, and is known to Torah students as the author of a critique of Maimonides' code of Torah law, the Mishnah Torah, upon which the Ravad wrote a series of glosses very critical of many of the detailed conclusions to which Maimonides came in his halachic decisions. And the Hasagot of Ravad on Maimonides are well known. Less well known to many people is that the Ravad is one of the key figures in the transmission of the Kabbalah. And I'd like to read to you a few words from the late Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's invaluable work on these subjects, Meditation and Kabbalah of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, in which he writes in his chapter on the earliest schools of the Kabbalah, on page 117, that there were a number of schools contemporary to the foundational Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, the father of Kabbalistic meditation, and the most important of these schools was in Provence, in France, heir to the mystical teachings of the Bahir, which was published in the late 1100s. Until the 12th century, the Kabbalah had been a carefully concealed mystery in the hands of a few very small and restricted secret societies. So hidden were these that some of the greatest rabbinical leaders were not even aware of their existence. The first ones to break this silence were the Kabbalists of Provence. The earliest known members of this school were Isaac and Jacob Nazir, both of Lunel. The title Nazir indicated that they had separated themselves from all worldly activities, devoting all their time to worship and the study of the Torah. The community supported a number of such individuals, creating an atmosphere where the contemplative life necessary for the teachings of the Kabbalah and its methods could flourish. Another important member of this group was Rabbi David ben Isaac, head of the rabbinical court, whose son, the famed Ravad, that I've been speaking about, Rabbi Avram ben David Posker, the author also of the glosses on Maimonides, was a master of the mystical arts. Ravad received the tradition from his father, as well as from his father-in-law, the famed Rabbi Avraham ben Isaac of Narbonne, best known as the author of the Eshkol. In his legal commentaries, the Ravad actually writes that his school was subject to divine inspiration and the revelations of mysteries. The Ravad's son, known as Isaac the Blind, inherited the leadership of the school from his father and brought it to Provence. Even though he was blind, he was reputed to be able to look into a person's soul and to see his thoughts. In his commentary on the Torah, Rabbi Bachya ben Asher calls him the father of Kabbalah. Rabbi Isaac the Blind had two disciples, Rabbi Ezra and Rabbi Azriel of Gerona, who assumed leadership of the school and authored a number of very interesting books on the Kabbalah. It is from them that the Kabbalah tradition passed to the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides, who lived from 1194 to 1270, one of the most important religious scholars and leaders of the period. And we may conclude that it was from the Ramban that the teaching came down eventually to Rabbi Isaac Luria, the master of the Kabbalah of 16th century Tzfat. But to get back to Ravad's commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, one of the most precious parts of this commentary is its very extensive introduction. It's 20 pages of Hebrew text here, with each one of which would probably cover 4 or 5 pages of a regular size of book, and pretty dense with lots of interesting diagrams and of one kind and another. But what is most remarkable about this work is that for our purposes, Ravad bases his whole introduction on the 50 gates of understanding, the Chamishim Sha'arei Binah, which he explains in his way of Kabbalah according to all of the 50 questions that God asks of Job in our chapters of 38 onwards. So Ravad indeed reveals the secret, and he tells us in his introduction, which we will not be learning in detail, but will, God willing, refer to. Ravad tells us that these were explanations and interpretations that he had received from his teachers. And the important point here is that with the enormous flights of eloquence in these coming chapters, there's no comparison between the eloquence of the Hebrew of the Tanakh, with even the most eloquent of the great poets of secular literature. For one who grew up in Britain with the staple diet of English literature being the plays of William Shakespeare, who has some extraordinary, beautiful and inspiring and moving passages. But when we look at our Hebrew text, we have to understand that the eloquence of these verses that we will be coming to, their beauty, their astonishing beauty in the English translation, let alone the original beautiful, stately Hebrew, this is not separate from the unfathomable depths of these words which are coming out of the storm wind from the mouth of God. In other words, Job was privy to the revelation of the 50 gates of understanding. And so we've come to the climax of this work of Job, which is all about initiating us into the ways of wisdom, following Job, that we should never suffer anything of those sufferings. But through our study of these works and through our attempt to empathize and to understand and to reflect and to learn about our situation, we are now being brought to this section, which is our profound depth, where every verse is not merely a rhetorical flourish, but is a mystical teaching with innumerable overtones, explaining to us the very secrets of the creation. And this is what we may gain from the commentary of Rabbi Avraham Ben David of Posker, the Ravad, from his introduction to Sefer Yetzirah, built upon the 50 questions that God puts to Job in Job chapters 38 onwards. And in our coming sessions, we will be looking at the Hebrew text and the commentaries on this amazing section. So with that, my friend, we will now, for today, leave our thoughts about the Tanakh, coming, God willing, in the coming week to actual study of these amazing Hebrew texts. And we'll take now a brief interval, after which I'll be back with a little more time than we've had recently for our Mishnah studies, in order to proceed with another very important and basic section of our Torah, the laws of circumcision. So I'll be back in just a few minutes. Shalom again, my dear friends, and back now to our studies, turning now to today's study of the Holy Mishnah. Shalom, today, the 14th day of the month of Sivan of the year 5777, corresponding to the 8th of June of the year 2017. And we'll continue today with our studies in the Mishnah, Tractate Shabbat, Masachet Shabbat, in chapter 19, where in the first Mishnah we have already learned that while the performance of a Brit Milah, the circumcision of the covenant on the Shabbat, is mandatory for a healthy baby, if the boy was born on the Shabbat and the 8th day after the birth is on Shabbat, it is mandatory to perform the mitzvah in its proper time, and it may not be deferred unless the child was unwell and unfit to be circumcised. However, we also learned that while everyone agrees that the act of circumcision is mandatory and therefore permissible on the Shabbat in its proper time on the 8th day, there was the dispute between the Tanaim about the permissibility of performing acts which are subsidiary to the main act of cutting the foreskin. In other words, we heard Rabbi Eliezer say that even if it was necessary to chop down the trees, to make the coals, to melt the metal, to make the knife on Shabbat, if another knife was not available, all of that could be done. Those would be called machshirei milah. Machshir, they make possible, they open the way for the milah. Rabbi Akiva stated that all of these subsidiary acts have to be done before the Shabbat, and if they were not done, then it may be impossible to carry out the circumcision on the Shabbat. So now our Mishnah turns to the actual process of the circumcision, and this is a key passage for understanding what is involved in the circumcision of a male child according to our Torah. Says the Mishnah, second Mishnah, Oisen kol tzorchei milo b'Shabbos. They may perform all of the needs of the circumcision, all that is required for the successful performance of the mitzvah itself on the Shabbat, as the Mishnah goes on to specify, mohalin. The work of the mohel, the person that does the circumcision, is from the root mohalin here. They actually cut off the foreskin. Ufoirein. Foirein is from the Hebrew root of revealing something, as in the case of the hair of the leper that is left uncovered, the hair of the Sota woman, Porua. It is normally covered over, but in those cases it is revealed and out there. So here the expression porin is a very important part of Torah law, and that is that the second stage after the cutting of the actual foreskin is the breaking of the membrane that covers over the crown of the male organ and peeling it off. This is normally done by the person doing the circumcision, perhaps with a fingernail or something else that breaks the membrane, enabling him to peel back this membrane. This is the membrane that is over the crown of the organ underneath the foreskin itself. So this is the second element of the circumcision, and as we shall see later in the chapter, the performance of the cutting of the foreskin without the pri'ah, the peeling back of the membrane, is not considered to be a proper Brit Milah. The third stage in the procedure, umoitzitzin, this is where the mohel, who must check that he is healthy and not suffering from any condition such as herpes, If he is hygienic, he will then, prior to the circumcision, wash his mouth out with disinfectant. Umoitzitzim, he actually applies his mouth directly to where the foreskin has been cut off and where the membrane has been peeled back, and he sucks in order to draw the blood to the surface, which is part of the healing process. V'noisen oleho isplonis, he puts upon it the isplonis, this is a plaster, a bandage. V'chamon, cumin, known for its antifungal and antiseptic properties. Cumin was traditionally used for this purpose, for disinfecting the place of the circumcision. Just a further word on the metzitzo, the actual sucking of the organ by the mohel. This, by tradition, is also an indispensable part of the procedure. Today, this has become controversial because of a very tiny number of cases of unhygienic and unregistered mohalim, circumcision people who had no business to be there, who actually succeed in getting the baby infected with herpes transmitted orally from the mouth of the mohel performing the traditional metzitzo to the baby. And that is criminal, and no mohel should be allowed to serve without a license from the rabbis and an absolute requirement to have his hygiene checked. The problem of herpes is particularly a problem in our times of loose morals, but in times of Jewish communities living the more normative Torah life, the hygiene in such areas would be high, and in any event today, certainly a mohel must be checked over for hygiene. So here we have the procedure of the circumcision, all of which may be performed on the Shabbat. And now our Mishnah tells us about the cumin for the antiseptic. Imlei shochak me erev Shabbos. If he did not grind the cumin from before the onset of Shabbat, the eve of Shabbat, lo'es b'shinov v'noisen, he could chew it with his teeth and put it on, apply it. That is to say that shrikat sammanim, the grinding of herbs for medical purposes, is prohibited on Shabbos. It is under the prohibition of techina, of grinding, and as we shall be discussing later on, even the taking of some medications for people who are not actually seriously ill on Shabbat is heavily hedged around with restrictions for fear that people would come to grind herbs on the Shabbat and therefore violate the prohibition against grinding. Well, now here, the application of the cumin is among the machshirei milah. That is to say, it's permitted to apply it, but to prepare it is not permitted on the Shabbat. It would have to be done from before the Shabbat. And if he had not prepared it and he needed to do it on the Shabbat, he would use this alternative way, which is not a normal way of grinding, which is permitted on this occasion because there is the need to make sure that the child is disinfected. So a Brit Milah performed on the Shabbat is a very special occasion because everybody is filled both with the joy of the Shabbat and the awe that nothing must be done that is against the spirit or the observance of the Shabbat, but the Shabbat tremendously enhances the holiness of the covenant because the Shabbat comes from every 7 days. In other words, each Shabbat is the 8th day after the previous one, and a baby that was born on the Shabbat and is circumcised on the Shabbat brings about much joy and awe in the communities. Well, now continuing in the second Mishnah about what the Moel can do if he'd not performed certain things, prepared them before the Shabbat. If the Mohel had not mixed up another surgical application of wine, the raw wine of antiquity, the shemen, the oil that would be presumably olive oil on, if he'd not made this mixture that was used for surgical medical procedures, if he'd not done it from before the Shabbos, he could apply one by itself and the other by itself. That is to say, apparently it was customary to use wine, which we know has antiseptic properties, and the raw olive oil, cold pressed of antiquity, probably had also very highly curative properties. But the actual mixture could not be done on Shabbos. Our Mishnah here is telling us, according to the commentators, that it's not that the mohel would have to put on the wine separately to the organ and the oil separately, but that he could pour them both successively into a bowl, and instead of actually mixing it up, which would be a weekday way of making such a preparation, he would simply toss the ingredients in the bowl around a bit until they mix up by themselves, and then apply it. The next part of our Mishnah speaks about what is customary in our day also of making a shield over the organ of the baby after the operation. The Mishnah says, "Ve'ein oisin lo chaluk." He cannot make for it, for the milah, for the organ, a bandage called a chaluk. A chaluk is normally the word for a shirt, and a basic shirt is has a hole in it for the head, and you put it over your head and pull it down over your body, and that is a chaluk. And the chaluk in our Mishnah is expression for a small piece of cloth that has a small perforation in it, which will be passed over so that the organ of the baby will pass through it, and the part of the organ that has been exposed by the cutting off of the foreskin and the peri'ah, peeling off of the membrane, that will be above, and the actual material of the cloth will be slipped around underneath the crown of the organ to prevent any residue of the foreskin from growing back over the crown of the organ. Now, the procedure may be carried out, the use of the chaluk. Our Mishnah telling here is that if the chaluk had not been prepared from before the Shabbat, ein oisin lo chaluk, lechatchila, you could not from the outset on the Shabbat prepare this little beged, this garment. Aval koirech oleho smartut. What he could do, b'di'avad, in the circumstances on the Shabbat when he cannot prepare the haluk, korech, he can wind around the organ a smartut, a small rag, which we will hope will be surgical. Im lo hiskin me'erev Shabbos, and indeed if he'd not prepared any kind of smartut, a surgical bandage, from before the onset of the Shabbat on Friday afternoon, korech al etzbo umevi. He could bring it from elsewhere, but he has to bring it in an unusual way so that he's not directly infringing the prohibitions against carrying from domain to domain on the Shabbat. Korech al etzba'o, he could wind the bandage in the house where he had it around his finger, umevi, and he could bring it to the place of the circumcision of afilu mechotzer acheres, even if it was from a different chatzer, a different courtyard. Well, here we are into the details of the rules about being able to carry from one courtyard to another on Shabbat. Normally, you can only carry from a courtyard belonging to one family into a courtyard belonging to another family if the two courtyards have an eruv between them made before the Shabbat to join them, as it were, into one private domain. Here our Mishnah is saying is that here in the event that we need for the success of the circumcision, which is a mitzvah, this bandage that was not prepared from before Shabbat, he's got to go and collect it. We may suspend the rabbinical prohibition against carrying from the domain of one family into the domain of the other. We must suspend this because it is at root a rabbinical decree, and we'll go back to the basic Torah law that one may carry from one chatzir to an adjacent chatzir, even when they're under different ownership. Well, so much for the actual procedure of the milah and the circumcision here in this section. We have indeed had a reference to the main aspects of the performance of the mitzvah. And now we come to another issue, which is the care of the baby boy, who, having had this milah, is considered to be a chole sheyesh bo sakana. He's a sick person, a chole sheyesh bo sakana. He's in danger because the milah, particularly for an 8-day-old baby, is a tremendous assault on the constitution of the child, weakening the child, causing cries and tears at the moment of the milah. And indeed the whole subject of the circumcision is a very harsh one, like the prophet Ezekiel says to Israel, "B'domayich chayi, b'domayich chayi." Through the blood of the Pesach sacrifice, have life. Through the blood of the circumcision that is shed on the baby, have life. But it's a very severe thing indeed to witness, and very weakening to the baby, that nevertheless this is prescribed by the Torah and has been performed in this way from generation to generation. Every circumcision, if the baby is healthy, is performed. If the baby was born on a Wednesday, the circumcision will be the following Wednesday, and so on. We shall have more to say about that in a later Mishnah. But for now, let's concentrate on the care of this baby after this very severe assault on him through the cutting of the foreskin. Marchitzin es hakoton. They may bathe the little baby, ben lifnei hamilo, whether it is before the actual circumcision in preparation, uvein la'achar hamilo, whether it is afterwards. We're talking here about the Shabbat on a weekday. In those days, this was practiced. In our days, the doctors and the Mohalim have somewhat different practices, but here our Mishnah is bringing us the practice of those times. It was permitted on the Shabbat to bathe the baby before and after the circumcision. Umezalfin olov bayod. The baby in the little tub or bowl where it's being washed, mezalfin olav, they can splash the water, the warm water, onto the baby. They can splash it on, but not with a keli, with a vessel. You couldn't take a cup or ladle to wash the baby, but to splash the water over by hand could be done. And now we come to a teaching that we've already encountered at the beginning of chapter 9 of this tractate. A teaching expressed here very slightly differently, but Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer, the outstanding sage that succeeded Rabban Gamliel as the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, after Rabban Gamliel was deposed, the contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, we may even wash the baby on the third day, that is to say, the third day after the circumcision, if that fell out to be on Shabbat, Shenema, as is said in our proof text for this teaching, and it was on the third day when they were in pain. Verse in Genesis chapter 34, verse 25, speaking of the inhabitants of the city of Shechem, whose leader Shechem had taken Jacob's daughter Dinah and raped her, seduced her and raped her, And the children of Jacob, in their fury at this, conspired to destroy the city, and they said that they would only agree to intermarry with them if they would circumcise, and they circumcised. And it was on the third day, when the people of Shechem were in pain, they were hurting, that was when the two sons of Jacob, Shimon and Levi, came into the town knowing that the third day was a day of their being very weak. There's discussion in the Talmud about whether the first and second days after the Milah will also allow us to bathe the baby in order to make him feel better. And some of the commentators consider that the first and second days are equally harsh, and this may be done on the Shabbat also. Others consider the third day as the worst day. The Talmud says that for the men of Shechem, the first and second day after the circumcision, they were not yet fully weakened by what had happened. They still had some strength, and that was why the children of Jacob chose the third day to stage their attack on them. They were entitled to make their attack because the people of Shechem had become complicit in an act of rape and of kidnap. And the Noahide law was that they, for kidnap, have to be executed. So this is the proof text for Rabbi Eliezer ben Azario, so that should be Rabbi Elazar ben Azario, that it is permitted to wash the child on the third day. And for all of these days, and particularly if the child is sickly, it's clear that this is a case of pikuach nefesh, of saving of life for a chole sheish bo sakono, a sick person that is in danger. Well, now we come to the rules of the eligibility for the practice of a circumcision on the Shabbat. Suffolk, a baby where there was a doubt whether he was actually born on the Shabbat, so that the following Shabbat would be 8 days after his birth. Such a doubt could arise if the baby was born and the actual birth process is somewhat protracted, and it's not always clear whether the baby was born in the late afternoon or the early evening. And throughout the halacha there is a question whether the dusk period relates to the day before, the day just gone by, or to the night coming on. So if, for example, a baby was born on late Friday afternoon as it's getting dusk, we cannot say for certain that is a baby born on the Shabbat. And since it is a case of Suffolk, ein mechalalin olav es HaShabbos, you cannot desecrate the Shabbos to perform a circumcision on a baby that's a Suffolk, a baby that it's a doubt if he actually was born on the Shabbat or still on the Friday afternoon. The same would apply with a baby born late Saturday afternoon towards the dusk, and the birth process is protracted. They're not sure, was he born late Saturday afternoon or was it already Saturday night? That is another case of safek, and in such a case the baby could not be circumcised on the Shabbat. Because there is a shadow of a doubt that he is not born on the Shabbat, we cannot allow the violation of the Shabbat involved in the circumcision. If it's not a circumcision in its proper time, it would have to be deferred to the next day. The second element in this Mishnah, the androgynos. Androgynos is a human that has the attributes and organs of both sexes, from the Greek words of andros, a man, and gunos, a woman. Androgynos is a hermaphrodite that has a male organ and a female organ. And our Mishnah says the Tanakama, for him also, because this is a doubt whether he is really qualifies as a full male, which is required to be circumcised on the 8th day, the androgynous, says the Tanakama, ein mechalalin olav es HaShabbos, we may not desecrate the Shabbos for him. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda matir androgynous. However, Rabbi Yehuda permits the circumcision of the androgynous on the Shabbat. The Tanakama, looking at Genesis chapter 17, verse 10, which says, circumcise for yourselves every male. Do you emphasize the word male or do you emphasize the word every? According to Rabbi Yehuda, when it says every male, that will come to include the androgynous who has a male organ, whereas the Tanakama would say that the verse in Genesis chapter 17, verse 10, which says to take off the orla, the foreskin, would apply only to one who is completely arel, who is completely uncircumcised, which would exclude this hermaphrodite, this androgynous that is actually half female. However, the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha is that in the case of a androgynous, the milah would not be performed on the Shabbat, it would be deferred. Well, now, in the fourth Mishnah, we come to another question which revolves around the fact that only if the child was truly an eighth-day baby that was born on the previous Shabbat, is it permitted to perform his milah, circumcision, on the following Shabbat. And if it's not actually a milah, a circumcision in its proper time, then this would not be a mitzvah, and the person doing it on the Shabbat might be considered to be liable for desecrating the Shabbat. Mishehoyu lo shtei tinoikos. Somebody, a mohel that had two babies. Echod lamul acha ashabos. One of them was to be circumcised after Shabbat, on Sunday. Ve'echod lamul b'Shabbos. One of them was a true Shabbat-born baby that has to be circumcised in his time on the eighth day when it falls on Shabbat. V'shochach, the mohel had an act of forgetfulness that he just mixed the babies up. Umol es shel achar Shabbos b'Shabbos. By mistake, he circumcised the baby that was to be circumcised on the Sunday, on the Shabbat day, namely on that baby's seventh day, when it's not a mitzvah to perform that circumcision. Chayov, that mohel is liable for making this cut in the baby, which is a violation of a melacha that is forbidden on the Shabbat and is not permitted, even in this case, because this is not a valid circumcision. So on this, everybody agrees. There is no dispute in our Mishnah about this case. The dispute comes in the following case. Echod lamul be'erev Shabbos, ve'echod lamul b'Shabbos. If there was one baby that was supposed to be circumcised on Friday, having been born presumably the previous Friday, ve'echod lamul b'Shabbos, there was the second baby that was to be circumcised on the Shabbat, having been born the previous Shabbat. V'shochach umoles shel erev Shabbos b'Shabbos. The mohel here forgot, absent-mindedly, he mixed up the babies. Mol es shel erev Shabbos, he circumcised the baby that was supposed to have been circumcised on the Friday, on the Shabbat. And we don't hear what he did with the other baby. He didn't do it on the Shabbat. But the problem is he circumcised a baby that was 9 days old on the Shabbat. And if the baby is older than 8 days, he may no longer be circumcised on the Shabbat. Even if he was a 9-day baby born on a Friday, he missed his Shabbat, he may not be circumcised on the Shabbat. Well, here there's a machloket tanoim, a dispute between the Tanas, Rabbi Eliezer, Machayev Chatos. Rabbi Eliezer here requires a sin offering for the forgetful act of performing a milah that was not on that Shabbat its proper time. The baby was overdue, and an overdue baby may not be circumcised anymore on the Shabbat. And Rabbi Eliezer considers that is not performing a mitzvah, and even though the baby has been circumcised, so that was the violation of one of the forbidden labors of the Shabbat. But Rabbi Yoshua Poiter, however, Rabbi Yoshua exempts the person from a sin offering, because even though he did do an act that was not mandatory and should not have been performed on the Shabbat, at the end of the day it was a circumcision. It counts as this baby having had his circumcision, although not done properly, and therefore he does not make him liable for sin offering, and the halacha is like Rabbi Yoshua. So now our Mishnah is going to sum up. And in Mishnah Hay, the fifth Mishnah, talks about how many days may elapse between the day of birth of the baby boy and his actual circumcision under certain circumstances. If he's a healthy baby, kotan nimol lishmono, the baby is circumcised on the 8th day. Lesisho, it could happen that he'd have to be circumcised on the 9th day. Or even after on the 10th day, or on the 11th day after birth, or the 12th, no more than that, no less, no more. That is to say, in the case of a healthy baby who was born on a date as our Mishnah will explain, the actual date of the circumcision may turn out to be any one of the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th days. In the proper manner, it's on the 8th day. Hoketzad. How is this, says our Mishnah, Kedarkoi, if it's in the normal way, Lishmona, the child is circumcised on the 8th day. Noilad ben Hashmoshes, however, if the baby was born ben Hashmoshes, between the sun, literally, this is called the twilight period, this is the Hebrew expression for the twilight period, namely sometime from the beginning of the setting of the sun all the way to the end of the sunset period, and this is a period that is subject to some dispute by the different halachic authorities, but let us simply take the general rule here that if the baby was born in the dusk period, as we've mentioned, and we're not sure whether it was the afternoon of the day just gone by or the night of the day to come, nimol lishtisho, he has to be circumcised on the 9th day. You cannot count from the day just gone by and circumcise him on that day, 8 days' time, because he is a safek. And therefore, in the case of a safek, he may not be circumcised on the doubtful 8th day. You have to wait till the 9th day to make sure that he's had a full term of 8 days. Ben Hashmoshe shel Erev Shabbos, if the baby was born towards nightfall on Friday, late afternoon, early evening, nimol la'asoro, for him, the 9th day would fall out on the Shabbat. He cannot be circumcised the following Shabbat because it's a doubtful case. Nimol asora, he's going to be circumcised at the end of 10 days, namely the following Sunday. Yom Tov la'achar Shabbos. What would happen if there's a festival on Sunday after Shabbat? Likewise, this baby that was born in the dusk period, Friday afternoon, just as he cannot be circumcised on the following Shabbat, he also cannot on Yom Tov. The same prohibition applies on Yom Tov to circumcising a baby that it is not his 8th day. In that case, where there is 1 day Yom Tov after Shabbat, which can happen in the case of Shavuot until our time, Nimol la'achad also, he is circumcised after 11 days. Shnei Yomim Tovim Shel Rosh Hashanah, if it was the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, which, according to all Talmudic views, is a 2-day festival. So if they came either on Sunday and Monday, or they came on Thursday and Friday, if the child was born on late Wednesday afternoon towards Wednesday evening, the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, or if Rosh Hashanah fell on Sunday, Monday, and the child was born on the previous Friday, late afternoon, evening, in all these cases, Nimol l'shneim also, presuming we're talking about a healthy baby, he is circumcised on the 12th day after the birth. With that, we proceed to the concluding, the end of Mishnah Hay. Kotna choile, a most important principle: if the child is sick, we do not circumcise that child until he will be healthy. This is a life-saving principle. Many cases are where some days after birth the baby develops a jaundice, which is a sign of the kidneys being slow to function. And when there's a jaundice or any other condition, that means that the circumcision could be a danger to the child's health. It is deferred. Well, finally, in Mishnah Vov, the 6th Mishnah, we come to more details about the parts of the circumcision that are permitted on the Shabbat. Elu ein hatzitzin ha'ma'akvin es hamilo. The following are the tzitzin. These are strands of skin of the orla. A tzitz, which also in Hebrew may mean a fringe of the hair, the lock of hair. The tzitz in this case is referring to some thin piece or some residue of the orla foreskin that remains. And I'm just going to teach us about what it is, hama'akvin es hamilo, that would stand in the way of its being considered a proper milah. That if it's left there, this is not a kosher circumcision. Basor achoife es roiv o atoro. That would be basor, the flesh of the foreskin, if it is covering the roiv o atoro, the better part of the atoro, crown of the male organ. That is an incomplete milo, and in such cases the person is not considered nimol, to have been circumcised. Ve'eno oichel batrumo. If the baby was a priest, if he had that residue of foreskin, he could not eat the priestly truma tithe offering, because the truma may not be eaten by an arel, by an uncircumcised, and he is still considered arel. Ve'im hoyo bal boso. If the person is a bal bosor, he is a fat, a plump, full person, mesaknoi mipnei maris ho'ayin, they should fix that on account of maris ho'ayin, the appearance to the eye. In other words, if the Jew, even if he was properly circumcised, but because of his physical appearance, there was a tendency for the flesh to cover over the crown of his organ, then he should have some operation to correct that so that everybody can see that he is properly circumcised. Even though he is, it is necessary also to satisfy what people are able to see. It can happen, for example, in a bathhouse, in a mikveh, place of ritual ablution, that people in the community would see that a person did not appear to be circumcised, and that would lead to very severe consequences in terms of that person's status in the community if it persisted to adult life. And for that reason, it would be permitted to fix this with the circumcision knife. Our Mishnah concludes, Mol v'loi pora, if the mohel performed the cutting of the foreskin, v'loi pora, but he did not perform the prio, peeling off of the membrane under the foreskin, v'loi pora es hamilo, he did not expose the place of the milo, ke'ilu lo mol, it is as if he did not circumcise. This is the Israelite practice of circumcision, that it is only complete with both the milo and the prio. The prio is not practiced by the Ishmaelite cousins, and for that reason their milah is not accepted as the fulfillment of the bris milah, the circumcision of the covenant. And prio, according to our oral Torah, is an integral part of the mitzvah of bris milah. With that, my friends, having somewhat run over in terms of time, but for the sake of the completion of the subject, we come to an end now of our studies for today in our Kollel program. And with the help of God, I'll be back this coming June 11th, Sunday at 1600 hours Israel time, and look forward to studying as we launch now into these amazing portions of Book of Job, and we will launch into new areas of Tractate Shabbat. With that, my dear friends, I wish you from Yerushalayim Kodesh, the holy city of Jerusalem, Shabbat Shalom U'Mevorach, a good and a blessed Shabbat, Bracha V'Atzlacha, blessing and success. Shalom from Yerushalayim.